Robert Downey Jr. stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A flight attendant watched him with disdain, unable to hide her arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. Before we dive deeper into this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another extraordinary story lined up for you. The New York City airport buzzed with its usual inner travelers rushing to and fro, conversations overlapping, and luggage wheels clattering in every direction. Amid the chaos, a man stood calmly in the first-class line. In the middle of it all, a man stood calmly in the first-class line. That man was Robert Downey Jr. He was dressed simply, a black turtleneck, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. He carried a leather bag that looked like it had traveled the world with him. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. Yet, anyone who took a closer look could sense something different about him. It wasn't just the way he dressed, but the calmness he exuded. He seemed like someone who didn't let the chaos around him affect his peace. While everyone else appeared rushed and anxious, Robert stood there, tranquil. He observed everything around him, as if soaking in the moment. He didn't mind the glances or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Right behind him in the line was Emily Carter, a flight attendant who had just finished her shift. Emily was the complete opposite of Robert. She wore a crisp, navy blue uniform, polished heels, and a perfume that demanded attention. Every movement she made seemed rehearsed, as though she wanted the world to know she was someone important. Her eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Robert, she couldn't hold back her comment. "First class, huh?" Emily said with an ironic smile. "You never know who might show up here these days." Robert turned his head and looked at her, keeping his expression calm. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises." Emily frowned for a moment. She seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what she thought about the man in front of her. But Robert stayed quiet, as if the comment didn't matter. Emily decided to push further. "Look, nothing personal," she said, chuckling softly. "But you don't seem like the type who flies like this. It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." The moment to board had arrived. The first-class line began moving forward, and Robert and Emily, without exchanging any more words, followed with their tickets in hand. Emily, as usual, walked with firm, confident strides, while Robert seemed oblivious to the commotion around him, walking at the same calm pace as before. When they finally entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching her seat, Emily checked her ticket once more, and as she looked up, she saw Robert settling into the seat, right next to hers. "You've got to be kidding me," Emily muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. She sat down beside Robert and let out a low chuckle, as if the situation was a joke. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Robert simply looked at her with that same calm demeanor and gave a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together, then," he replied politely. Emily crossed her arms, trying to hide her discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that she was sitting next to Robert, but the thought that the man she had judged moments ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as her. She couldn't quite explain why, but Robert's presence unsettled her in a way she couldn't ignore. As the economy-class passengers finished boarding, Emily decided to strike up a conversation, but not in a friendly way. "So, what do you do for a living?" she asked with the casual tone of someone who already thought they knew the answer but wanted confirmation. Robert, who was adjusting his bag under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Emily raised her eyebrows as if surprised. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" Robert gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Emily laughed. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." Robert looked at her for a moment, assessing the situation, but maintained his calm demeanor. "I think we all have our place," he replied, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." Emily let out a short laugh. "That's nice, kind of philosophical even, but real life isn't that simple. Robert didn't respond immediately. He just turned back to the window, as if the conversation was over. But Emily wasn't done yet. "You know what?" Emily said, leaning slightly toward him. "You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people." This time, Robert didn't respond with words. He simply looked at her for a moment, with an expression that combined patience and a certain firmness. It was the kind of look that said more than any words ever could. Emily, realizing her provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into her seat with a satisfied smile. She thought she had the upper hand in the situation, but the truth was that things were only just beginning. Emily was convinced she was in control, but Robert's calmness hid something she couldn't foresee. With every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. With the plane already in the air, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks, and Emily made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please," she said with a confident smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant, accustomed to demanding passengers, nodded with a professional smile. When it was Robert's turn, he made a simple request. "Just water, please." Emily didn't miss the opportunity to comment. She looked at Robert with that same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. "Water?" she asked, almost laughing. "Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water." Robert took the bottle the flight attendant handed him and replied calmly, "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Emily narrowed her eyes, as if trying to decipher the answer, but quickly decided to push back. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Robert raised the bottle and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Other passengers began to notice Emily's provocative tone, but since Robert appeared unbothered, no one intervened. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," Robert finally said with the same calmness as always. Emily didn't like the answer. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "Or maybe people who say that never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know?" The flight attendant who was serving another passenger cast a discreet glance in their direction, as if considering stepping in, but she noticed Robert was handling the situation well. He responded with nothing more than a slight smile, turning back to look out the window. Emily, on the other hand, didn't seem satisfied. She wanted to provoke more, but was beginning to realize that Robert was a difficult opponent to rattle. Emily was convinced she was winning the dispute, but for the passengers around her, her arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. While Robert remained calm, Emily was about to face a reality that would completely change her views on people. The flight attendant returned to the section of the cabin where Robert and Emily were seated. As she served another round of drinks, Emily decided to continue the conversation, or rather, her string of provocations. "You know, life is like flying first class," she began, gesturing with her champagne glass. "You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Robert placed his water bottle on the seat tray and finally turned to face Emily. His gaze was calm, but there was something different in it now, as if he was ready to respond more directly. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" Robert said, his tone serene but firm. The passengers around them, who had previously been discreetly observing, began to pay closer attention. The cabin was almost uncomfortably silent. A few exchanged glances, noticing the subtle clash between the two. Emily smiled, clearly trying to hide that the response had hit her in some way. "Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Robert leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the value of being here," he gestured around the seat, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." The phrase hung in the air like an undeniable truth. Some passengers nodded slightly, while others exchanged approving glances. Emily, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable. She tried to laugh it off, but her nervousness was starting to show. That's a good one. First, class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks, she said, trying to keep her tone sarcastic. Robert simply gave a short smile and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without saying anything more. His calmness seemed to speak louder than any words. The passengers around them began to react subtly. Some whispered to one another, while others looked at Emily with disapproving expressions. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who appeared to have recognized Robert, remained silent, respecting his privacy but clearly admiring the way he handled the situation. Emily, meanwhile, began to notice she was being watched, and not in a positive way. Her posture, once so confident, began to shift slightly, but she still wasn't ready to admit she had lost control. Emily thought she was winning the dispute, but the reactions around her told a different story. She didn't yet know that what was coming next would make her question everything she believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses, Emily seemed determined to win the debate she had started. "You know what's funny?" Emily continued. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Robert leaned forward slightly, looking Emily in the eye. "I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words hung in the air for a few seconds, and Emily seemed momentarily stunned, struggling to find a response. She opened her mouth but couldn't immediately form the right words. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by the way Robert handled the provocations. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," Emily said, finally recovering. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Robert leaned back in his seat and replied calmly, "Maybe. But I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." Robert Downey Jr.'s words seemed to carry weight throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others shot disapproving looks at Emily, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged this way. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Many passengers were now fully tuned into the exchange between Robert and Emily. An older man sitting nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to express disapproval of Emily's behavior. Emily, aware of the stares, tried to hide her irritation, but instead of backing down, she threw out another jab. "Cheap philosophy might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Robert looked at her, still maintaining the same tranquil expression. "The real world is made by people, Emily. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." Emily was visibly uncomfortable with the response. She glanced around, noticing that the passengers' attention was no longer in her favor. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Emily was beginning to realize that her strategy of dominance wasn't working. She thought she had the upper hand, but the impact of Robert's words was changing the perception of the passengers and perhaps even her own. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Emily crossed her arms, trying to mask the discomfort caused by Robert's words, but her irritation was starting to show. Robert, however, seemed unaffected by the atmosphere. He turned directly to Emily and broke the silence with a calm tone. "You know, Emily, I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive. But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper in insecurity, an inner struggle." Emily furrowed her brow, unsure whether this was a provocation or a genuine attempt at conversation. "Inner struggle?" she said, laughing nervously. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Robert gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Maybe. But I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to feel something missing inside them." The words hit Emily in an unexpected way. She fell silent for a moment, fiddling with the bracelet on her wrist almost absent-mindedly, but she quickly recovered her defensive tone. "That's not me. Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for, and I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Robert remained calm, as if carefully choosing his next words. He observed Emily for a few seconds before continuing. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Emily pressed her lips together, visibly uncomfortable. The question seemed to echo in her mind, but she wasn't ready to admit that it struck a chord. "Who are we?" She replied with a cynical laugh. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Robert held her gaze, his expression now more serious. "I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside." He pointed to his chest, and his words resonated throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, while Emily appeared to struggle to maintain her composure. "That's easy for you to say," Emily said, almost rising from her seat. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." Robert responded firmly but without raising his voice. "You're right. I don't know your story. But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something: fear, insecurity, loneliness." The statement hit like a brick. Emily froze, her face flushed with anger and perhaps shame. She clenched her fists, clearly struggling to contain an outburst. Finally losing her composure, Emily stood up abruptly, knocking her empty champagne glass to the floor. "You think you're better than me?" she shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. "Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life. But you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world." The passengers fell silent, shocked by Emily's outburst. The flight attendant quickly approached, trying to defuse the situation. Robert remained seated, looking at Emily calmly. He waited for her to finish speaking before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said with a tone that was firm yet gentle. "I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters. And Emily, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words seemed to strike Emily deeply. She was breathing heavily, but something in Robert's voice made her sit down again. She averted her gaze, looking more defeated than angry. Emily sat in silence, Robert's words echoing in her mind. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, in front of so many people. But she still didn't know that the worst or perhaps the best was yet to come. The flight continued in a heavier silence after the confrontation. Emily remained in her seat, avoiding looking at Robert, but it was evident she was deeply unsettled. Robert, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed, as if nothing had happened. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Robert with a polite smile. Her voice caught the attention of the entire cabin. "Mr. Downey, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Downey seemed to echo through first class. Some passengers who until then had been quietly observing widened their eyes. A murmur began to spread through the cabin, and that's when Emily froze. "Downey?" she murmured almost in disbelief. "Robert Downey Jr.?" Robert nodded politely to the flight attendant and thanked her, not paying much attention to the commotion. He turned to Emily, who now looked at him as if she were seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Emily?" Robert asked with a slight smile. Emily opened her mouth but couldn't form a sentence. She looked around, noticing other passengers, observing her with curious and, in some cases, disapproving glances. She looked completely lost. Emily sank into her seat, clearly uncomfortable. She began mumbling a few words, trying to justify her actions. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were," she finally said. "I didn't know that you were. You." Robert kept his tone calm, but there was firmness in his words. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Emily remained silent for a moment before attempting to defend herself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Robert let out a small sigh and leaned forward slightly. "Emily, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people. The words left Emily speechless. She looked at Robert, then at the other passengers, who now seemed even more attentive to what was unfolding. The humiliation on her face was undeniable. The silence in the cabin was broken by Robert, who decided to conclude the conversation with a final lesson. You know, Emily, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger. Emily nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, she seemed to genuinely reflect on her actions. Robert leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. Meanwhile, Emily remained motionless, staring at her hands as if replaying every word in her mind. Emily wasn't just confronted by Robert, she was confronted by reality itself. She began to realize that in her attempts to humiliate someone else, she had revealed more about herself than she ever intended. The rest of the flight was marked by a heavy silence. Emily, who once seemed like she owned the space, now looked visibly uncomfortable. She could barely meet the eyes of Robert or the other passengers. The arrogance she carried at the start of the journey had disappeared, replaced by something much closer to shame. As the minutes passed, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Robert's words. Everything he had said seemed so simple, yet at the same time it struck deeply. Emily began questioning her own behavior, recalling how many times she had judged people without even trying to know them. Maybe he's right, she murmured to herself without realizing. She glanced at Robert, who was calmly reading a book, as if nothing had happened. This only amplified the impact of the situation. Robert hadn't made any effort to prove himself. He had simply let his actions speak for him. As the plane began to prepare for landing, Emily finally mustered the courage to say something. She turned to Robert, her eyes still lowered, and said, "I need to apologize. Not for what I said just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Robert looked at her, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology, but more than that, I hope you learn from this." Emily nodded slowly, realizing that those words were an opportunity for change. Then Robert continued, "Sometimes, what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Emily remained silent, but Robert's words stayed in her mind. She knew that moment had the potential to change something inside her if she allowed it. After disembarking, Emily stood still in the terminal, watching Robert walk away. She saw fans discreetly approach him to greet him and take pictures. Robert greeted each one with patience and a genuine smile, without haste or arrogance. It was evident that his simplicity and kindness came from within. Emily looked down at her own hands and sighed. She knew she needed to change. Robert's words still echoed in her mind, a reminder that a person's true worth isn't about their status, but about how they choose to treat others. As Robert disappeared into the airport crowd, Emily felt something new, hope. Maybe that encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others or to become better people? Robert's words leave a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you.